Good morning, everyone. So, our final lesson of the year concerns the life in the trenches for British soldiers during the First World War. So, at the beginning of the war in 1914, men from all across the British Empire, from Africa, from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India and the Caribbean, all decided that they wanted to join up and fight for king and country. They formed their own regiments, and many of them saw active service in France in particular, but in other parts around the world. However, by the time they got to France and the British dug in with their trenches, the rain and the weather was dreadful. It was very, very difficult for the British to gain much ground because of the bog and the rain and the horrendous conditions that many soldiers found themselves in. So as a result of this, many soldiers ended up with a condition known as trench foot. Trench foot occurs when your feet are never dry for weeks at a time. Think about it if you have a piece of wood and you leave it in water for a long time and it begins to rot away. And this is what happened to many young soldiers in the First World War. They were stuck in trenches for months at a time. Their feet are always covered in water, their boots rot away, and it's incredibly painful. It's very, very difficult to walk, and you end up in hospital, and you have to recover, and it's a very, very painful experience to go through. This war was truly horrific, particularly in the early part of the war. The conditions made things absolutely awful. What we see here in this image is a horse and cart attempting to move things through the bog. And if supplies are unable to get through to the people on the front lines, they go hungry, they don't have enough ammunition. It truly was a terrible, terrible period. But aside from the conditions and the weather, the actual fighting of the war was incredibly horrific. The tactics were relatively primitive, especially in the early part of the war. And for the most part, they involved walking towards the enemy trenches and hoping you didn't get gunned down. This image is entitled "The Loneliest Place in the World." What we see is one British soldier attempting to peer up over the top of his trench. And if you look closely on the PowerPoint at home, you will see that many of his friends, particularly here and further up the trench, are all dead. This is a corpse that has been covered up. What these men went through in the First World War was something people hoped would never ever happen again. The sheer loss and devastation of large numbers of young men was something truly horrific. But the tactics kept getting worse and worse. In 1915, for the first time, the Germans deployed gas against French soldiers and later against British soldiers. What happened with the artillery shells as they would be fired over, canisters of gas would also be fired. The gas would spread out and it would attack the lungs of people. Unless you were issued with a gas mask, and even these weren't particularly effective, it meant that you were in trouble. A quick remedy, although its effectiveness is somewhat doubted, is if you took a handkerchief and urinated on it and then wrapped it around your face, it might keep some of the gas out. But aside from attacking the lungs, the gas would also attack the eyes, and it was a truly horrific thing to do. The British attempted to use it against the Germans, but when they fired their gas canisters, the wind was blowing the opposite direction, and as their soldiers marched towards the German positions, the gas taken by the wind blew back into the British faces. The weapons of the period had far advanced the tactics. And this is the consequence of it. Hundreds and hundreds of young men, and many of them lived with the consequences for the rest of their lives as victims of these gas attacks. You could be permanently blinded, you could have breathing problems for the rest of your life. But as the war ventured into stalemate by 1916, the British commander, Field Marshal Haig, came up with his plan. This plan was to take place in June of 1916 at a place called Somme. Now, Haig envisioned this. If we could shell the Germans with artillery for 2 straight weeks we would destroy every single position they had, simply because we would drop enough bombs that we would never miss a target. At the end of the 2 weeks, the British would go forward, along with Australians and Canadians and so on, and take over the German positions, and we would do this repeatedly until we reached Germany. The plan was put into place, and the shelling began. So for 2 solid weeks, the German positions were shelled. The British figured they were invincible. Gigantic shells destroyed, in theory, the German positions, and the British got ready for the attack. However, unbeknownst to the British, the German trenches, they had dug down many, many feet and set up their barracks underground. For 2 weeks, the Germans simply went underground. Very little damage was actually caused by the British shelling, certainly not enough to destroy the German defences. Once the shelling stopped, all along the front line in the trenches, British officers blew their whistles and their men leapt out of the trenches to attack the German positions. So, at particular times, different units in the trenches would be given the time. So you blow a whistle and all your men would leap out of the trenches and march forward. Now initially, once they leapt out of their trenches, they gained large amounts of ground, but that was because there was no German opposition. Once the Germans became aware that the shelling had completely stopped, they got out of their bunkers, went to their trenches and manned their defensive positions. What they saw was thousands of British soldiers heading towards them. They got to their machine guns and began mowing down the British soldiers heading towards them. And it was a truly, truly horrific period. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British sustained 50,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead. Entire units and regiments are completely wiped out. There's a story of one officer who's gone back to the headquarters and he's been told, you need to take your men and you need to attack this position. And his reply was, I don't have any men left. What you've got to remember is, the people who fight wars are very, very young, 18, 19, 20. And entire towns and villages lose 50, 60, 70% of their young men on one day. There are some successes. For example, the Ulster Division, they managed to take some of their positions, but they sustained, and it's in your booklet, incredibly high casualties. The Newfoundland Regiment from Canada sustained something like 90% casualties. And as we will see shortly, what they gained at the Battle of the Somme was incredibly inconsequential to the outcome of the rest of the war. However, eventually the British do have a breakthrough, and it's through the invention of the tank. Now, these things are unreliable, but the Germans don't know how to stop it. So the tanks would be sent out forward, soldiers would follow them, and they could gain large amounts of ground very, very quickly. We look at this map of France. This is where the Battle of the Somme took place, and the bit in purple is the ground that was taken after months of battle. It works out that for each yard of ground, so a yard is about 3 feet or 1 metre, for each yard of ground that the British took, it cost them around 1,000 deaths. So it really, really was a horrific, horrific ordeal to have gone through. The other thing, and I really would suggest watching this video on the PowerPoint with the link, is this idea of shell shock, as it was known in the First World War. Of all the horrors that had gone through, eventually these young men in the trenches would break down. Not all of them, but many of them. Some people are just impossible, just could not go on any longer. Now, because medicine wasn't especially sophisticated, particularly to do with things like mental health, many of these people were just accused of being cowards, and about 300 or so of them were shot. But if you watch the video, you can see sort of the psychological scarring that some of these men go through. On occasion, they would have sort of nervous tics, they would move their their arms or limbs in a peculiar way. There's an instance of one man who would constantly drop the bottom part of his mouth open and close it all the time. And it was later revealed that it's because he was forced to bayonet, so with a big long knife, a German in the face. And that ended up staying with him and scarring him for the rest of his life. So I would certainly suggest watching that. This final image I'm going to show you is an image of a Scottish regiment. So this is in 1914, just before they were sent out to war. Okay, they're all ready, they're all in their uniforms. This is the image in 1918. These are the only men who survived. So there's about 500 or so people in this original image, and by the end there's perhaps 30. This truly was one of the most horrific events of our island's history. Whether you think the war was worth fighting or not is something that you can learn and research for yourself, but it certainly was something that people hope never to repeat again. But as we all know, only 30 years later, there would be another war, which in some ways was far more horrific. So, thank you, Year 8. Make sure you read through and answer all the questions, and I will see you all in September, hopefully.